Hi, we are here with Alan LaPolice. He is an educator and has run for office here in Kansas 3 times. And he's joining us today to talk about the 28th Amendment and getting big money out of politics and how that issue affects us in many ways across the nation. So first, I think if you could just share some of your background in politics here in Kansas and the basic experience that you've had running for office here.
Absolutely. So I am indeed in north central Kansas. I am a 5th generation Kansan. Grew up on a dairy farm, and ultimately I became an educator too. So I am a farmer, I'm a combat veteran and an educator, and my involvement in politics started back in 2013 when the first government shutdown was occurring, and you had one of the prominent leaders in the Senate reading Green Eggs and Ham. There was a counterpart in the House, and that was actually the 1st district congressman. And he was trying desperately to shut down the government and not pay the sovereign debt. And what really kicked it off for me was when I saw a lot of combat veterans, my brothers and sisters in arms, who were trying to get into the war memorials in DC, and they were shut down. And this is something that my congressman seemed gleeful about. I disagreed, so I decided to get involved in replacing him. Finding no one willing to run against him, because no one, rarely do people take on popular incumbents, I was advised to run myself. So in 2014, I filed and ran in the Republican primary against the incumbent congressman. I very nearly won. I got over 45% of the vote. In 2016, I decided that the person that was bound to replace him was no better, if not possibly worse. So I ran again, but this time I got to do it my way, which was as an independent. And so I saw all the challenges of running a campaign as an independent without a party. And then in 2018, several people asked me if I'd run again, and they semi-recruited me. They solicited me to take on the Democratic banner. And so I ran as an independent again, but proudly in the Democratic primary. I won that, and then I went into the general, and I did the best that I could. And I received, I guess, more votes than any independent has received in Kansas in a House race in history.
Wow. So can you share how those experiences that you've had in politics and from a wide range of angles have influenced your view of big money in politics and how big of a problem that is for our entire system?
This was the most paramount issue for me starting way back in 2014. I've gone on record repeatedly saying that no matter what it is you, the voter, want to accomplish, whether it be social justice or environmental concerns or criminal justice or anything, defending the ag economy, defending manufacturing, no matter what it is that you want to accomplish, you, the average voter, will not have a say in that. You don't have a seat at the table as long as big money does. See, any of these federal races now cost millions of dollars. And I've got this quick analogy of, there was a war veteran in my hometown, and I had to sit down and talk with him because I was looking for a contribution, but I also wanted his vote. And we talked for about an hour, and he went in detail about how I was going to defend the VA and how I was going to guarantee his disability check and I was going to do the right thing. And it took me this hour to convince him that I was the candidate for him. And in the end, he was very pleased, and so he wrote me a check for $20. Now, a couple days later, I went and talked to a billionaire in a part of the state, and 45 minutes talking to him, and he was able to write a maximum check. At the time, a maximum check, I think, was $5,400. But more importantly, he had access to dozens of other people who could write maximum checks. And this individual went on later to fund a super PAC without my permission, in fact, with my rejection. So he was able to put in approximately $250,000 based on a 45-minute conversation. Now, I talked to this veteran for an hour, and I got $20. Mm-hmm. So the reality that people need to understand is that a politician who wants to win will not talk to you if the most you can give them is $20.
Right.
Because it's literally a waste of their time. I was given advice by then Speaker of the House and the then Executive Director of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Stop talking to voters. Stop talking to constituents entirely. It's a waste of your time. You should be dialing for dollars, and you should be holding big fundraisers where you can get max checks. And more importantly, some of those max checks will evolve into an independent expenditure committee or a super PAC. And that's the only way to win. You see, if a somewhat contested federal seat in Congress, a House or a Senate, costs between $2 million and $30 million, you don't have enough time to talk to that low dollar voter. You don't. I calculated that to talk to that vet, to get enough money to win this uncontested seat, this Kansas seat, 40 years. 40 years of talking to individuals like him, and that's without sleep.
Right.
So I cannot stress enough that until money comes out of politics, none of the things that you want done, no matter what they are, they won't get done until you take money out of the equation and you restore some semblance of democracy where voters have a say, not donors, or not merely donors.
And what have you seen on the other side of that equation once a person who has received a lot of money is elected and is an official? Then what does access look like at that point in terms of the people who have donated a lot of money, or what is their influence compared to the influence of the average voter?
I think Princeton did a study where they took the concerns of the average voter and the concerns of the business community, the donor class, and the average voter had a statistically non-existent 0% influence on policy. So once you're elected, all those donors, then they expand, they reinvest, they double down, but also now you have access to K Street. And K Street is the lobbying wing of our government, and they decide what becomes law. They decide what legislation is even talked about. And they run the system, they run our political system, because if you offend K Street, then they turn off the money. And what they can actually do is turn that money against you. Most members of Congress don't fear a general election where there's a real competitor with different viewpoints. Most politicians fear a primary. And if you offend K Street, if you offend the lobbyist money, they will put that money against you in a primary, and they can beat you with just a mouthpiece.
Right.
So it is imperative that if we want to restore any form of a government of, by, and for the people, the only thing that the most important thing we can do is turn off that flow.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about something that I know is important to you personally and that is also important to our state of Kansas and our whole region and our nation. Farmers, agriculture. I know you are a farmer, your family have been farmers. How does this issue of big money in politics influence everyday farmers? How does it influence our agriculture system as a whole?
Let me clarify, because I don't make my primary income from farming anymore. Few individuals do. The family farm in America is all but dead. We took a hit back in the 80s because of some policies, all those songs, the Farm Aid and all that. That took a huge toll, and ultimately that cost my family our dairy operation in the end. But since then, we have re-inflicted a bunch of policies that have started the final dissolution, the end of family farming. The biggest issue is concentration of power, concentration of who runs the farming operations. The best example is that many years ago, a lot of the beef packers, they started to concentrate their power, and they just really focused on fewer and fewer packers. And so they controlled the price of beef from the farmers. So they could take the cattlemen and they could give them the lowest possible price on that commodity. And then they were the power holders of the distribution of all of our beef. So there's a couple of companies, JBS and Marfrig and Tyson. These packers concentrated their power, and they were able to suppress the price of beef. Now, you know that steak costs $8, $10, $16 per pound, and yet the farmer might see $1 from that. The farmer might see just like 10 cents on the dollar of that. And that's because concentration of power with the packing and with basically the corporate food powers. Farming cannot exist under those circumstances where the producer is asked to sell his product for less than the cost of production. And that's because of these global corporations like Tyson. An interesting fact, DuPont the company DuPont, chemical company, they also own 80% of the patents on seed stock. So of all the seed stocks in the world, DuPont owns 80% of those patents. And if a small farmer were to get caught using those seeds, or even if DuPont can convince a court that they were using their seeds, they'll lose their farm because this company owns all the patents to the seeds. So they got to pay that distributor whatever they want to charge for seed. DuPont was sold to Bayer, a German company. So now an international foreign corporation owns most of the patents for farming. So whether it's beef production, chicken production, pork, or grain, the small family farm has lost all power because of this concentration. That concentration is, I say it's sort of the canary in the coal mine for the rest of American democracy. As power is concentrated in the hands of a few, everybody on the bottom or in the middle of that spectrum, they lose. Right now in Kansas, the suicide rate for farmers is at an all-time high. There are no more family dairy farms, or hardly any. There are very few family chicken farms. There are no family pork farms. And everybody else is just struggling to make it. Being a farmer and watching all of my farming friends in the farming community lose, it affects me deeply. And they have lost because of this concentration of power and because they don't have political power. That is emblematic of the entire problem. The voter may think that they have political power, but if they're not a max donor, they don't. And it's the exact same thing with production agriculture. That's what democracy's become. The power rests in the hands of the people with the most influence, and that concentrated power equals political power.
Absolutely. So I also wanted to touch on another component that I know is personally important to you and very important to our nation. You are a veteran. How have you seen this systematic problem in our nation affect veterans and affect the people that you care about and were in combat with in your life?
22 a day. I'll start with that. And I don't mean to make this entire thing about loss of hope, but 22 veterans take their lives every single day. And we're not doing nearly enough to fix this problem. And why is it that these veterans are taking their lives? Could it be that we haven't won any of our occupations overseas? Could it be that a lot of my brothers and sisters in arms have been occupying Afghanistan and Iraq for nearly 2 decades without any kind of end in sight? Could it be that they feel that they're fighting these wars for Americans and for American democracy, but in the end, are they? In the end, are they not simply occupying oil-rich regions of the world and giving up their limbs, giving up their liberties, sometimes giving up their very souls for a campaign that's just based on power? It's just based on an oil economy, or it's based on where opium poppies are grown.
Right.
So these veterans, they deserve representation too. I can't think of any combat veteran who fought for OPEC, or who fought for Halliburton, or who fought for Tyson. They fight for freedom and liberty, and they fight for Americans. They don't fight for Republicans. They don't fight for Democrats. They don't fight for political powers. They don't fight for corporate reach. They fight for liberty in this country. And when you realize that perhaps for the past 2 decades we have not been fighting the good fight, people get despair. They become hopeless. I feel that these vets are taking their lives, and I feel that every person who's sworn an oath to defend the Constitution, they deserve better from their government. And they want a government that does what they do, which is put everything on the line for the Constitution and for Americans, not corporations and not greed.
Yeah. So yes, we see really many areas where this concentration of power throughout the system leaves the people at the bottom and at the middle, everyday American, feeling despairing and feeling hopeless and unsure how they can affect any meaningful change. So I'm curious, what's your perspective on that? How did you come to get involved with American Promise? And if you can speak just a little bit about sort of what your vision of a solution is here, and how these Americans who may be despairing actually do have power to change what we're seeing and change our own circumstances here in our nation.
I do have hope for the future. A lot of people like to criticize the millennial generation, but I believe in them. And there are enough people who, when they realize that their democracy has been taken from them, when they realize that their political voice is being robbed from them and from the next generations to come, I believe that there's enough of that generation to stand up and say, no, we were founded on these principles that every man, woman, and child are entitled to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. They're equal in the eyes of the law. They're equal in the eyes of society. And I believe that when that generation and other generations realize their own power, that they will choose the leaders that will bring us into that new generation, that will bring the type of reform that our nation is famous for. We had dark times in the Civil War, and we had leaders that pulled us from the brink of our own self-destruction. We had the Depression era, we had Civil Rights era. We've had dark days in our past, but the thing that makes America exceptional, and I'll say there is an American exceptionalism, and that's that when the time is so vital, when it's so needed, there are brave men and women who rise to leadership roles. Mm-hmm. We've had great times. We killed fascism. We defeated fascism. We defeated, to some extent, we defeated a lot of the social injustices of the 50s and 60s. We've been on the side of right more often than we've been on the side of wrong. Mm-hmm. And I have to believe that we will be on the side of justice and the side of right.
Well, that's something I think is really exciting. Is it can feel as if there are very few issues that both sides, people of all political persuasions, agree on in this nation. But the influence of big money in politics and needing to change that systemic issue is one that is supported by 80% of both sides of the aisle, mm-hmm. Of people. So I do think that going forward, this issue, some of these systemic democracy reforms that everyone wants are going to rise up from both sides and can be actually a uniting factor for our nation that does feel very divided right now. Curious what your thoughts are on that.
I agree. I've talked to a lot of elected officials, a lot of members of Congress in both the House and the Senate, and not one single member of Congress says that they like the influence of money. They don't say that they enjoy spending 75 to 80% of every single day talking to donors and raising money. They all denounce it. Mm-hmm. Now the thing is, they're too afraid to do anything about it. Mm-hmm. I've had friends on the left who recently said, well, why should we unilaterally disarm? And that's the thing. No one thinks that they can take that first stand. It's like, well, I'm not going to take K Street money. I'm not going to take super PAC money. I'm not going to do that. So they quite literally can't.
Right.
No elected official can, for fear of just being made irrelevant. But we can.
Right.
We can. We can be the voice that says we're going to choose the ones. We're going to select the ones who understand that this is paramount to every other issue. We can select those candidates, those visionaries, those leaders who run and seek higher office, and we can say, we're going to put you in there. And once enough of them are in there, the other ones who claim to not like the influence of money, they will have cover to jump on board, to slide into the trenches with those patriots who are fighting the influence of money. And I need to be clear, I am not anti-corporation. Mm-hmm. We are a capitalist society, but we're also, to some extent, a socialist society because we have social programs that have worked. Mm-hmm. And those two things, that's not a binary. Those two things can work together. So I want America to be the powerhouse of industry and of business, and I want corporations to live here. But corporations can't be patriotic. They don't have the ability to be patriotic. People do. Mm-hmm. So we can find a voice through organizations like American Promise. Find that voice, get those people into positions of power to where they can make the needed change. Now, I've been claiming or calling for the 28th Amendment since I started back in 2014, and I didn't hear anybody. People were, but I didn't know that I was not alone in calling for the 28th Amendment. And I've many times said, until we pass this, until we overturn Citizens United and another Supreme Court decision, McCutcheon, until we can overturn them, nothing else gets done. And so my swan song, my vision was 28th Amendment. American Promise is that vision materialized in an organization that is solely focused on that one thing, the 28th Amendment, overturning Citizens United and restoring power to the people.
And for our, political wonks out there, why an amendment? Why is the amendment the way versus legislation or some other solution? What's unique about an amendment, and why is that the way that the American people can affect this change?
Two parts. The first is our political system is designed with our three-part government. So you've got the executive there simply to execute the law as put forward by the legislative. The legislative creates law, they draft it, they sign it in, and goes to the people, or goes to the president and then the people. But the judiciary is the interpreter, the arbiter of law. Now, in 2010, the Supreme Court decided that corporations had a voice. Corporations could use money in unlimited amounts. They could use money as a voice. And so this decision, the Citizens United decision, to me, is probably as bad as pre-Civil War, the Dred Scott decision. Sometimes our Supreme Court, the arbiter of justice and of law, they get it wrong, and they got it wrong. Now, if the Congress writes a law that says, well, money's not speech, doesn't matter. Supreme Court already said it is. So it will go back to the Supreme Court, but until that day that Citizens United is completely abolished, it doesn't matter what the legislature says. But if you enshrine that idea that corporations aren't people and that money is not speech, until you enshrine it in the Constitution, which is the blueprint that the Supreme Court uses, until you do that, it doesn't matter what our Congress does. It only matters what the Supreme Court interprets. It becomes the 20th Amendment. The Supreme Court has no choice but to say, well, using the Constitution, we're going to have to agree with you.
Right.
So either the legislature, which is the Congress, either they pass the 28th Amendment on their own, or we do it and hand it to them and say, this is the will of the people, follow our will, or risk being defeated in your next election. Right. So it has to be this way. It has to, you can't wait for a Supreme Court decision to just roll it back. Like the Dred Scott decision, they determined that this man was a slave and he didn't have a voice. So Citizens United, we have to determine that money is not a protected thing, and it doesn't have a voice. And corporations, while they can exist, they are non-persons. They are not natural-born citizens deserving any constitutional protections. I think it's as important as Dred Scott. Dred Scott preceded a civil war, and now we've got, so if Dred Scott preceded what became a war based on race, Citizens United, it is basically preceding a possible conflict based on class, political class, economic class, wealth. And unless we change that, we are bound towards some other cataclysmic event like we saw in the 1860s.
Well, that leads in very well to what can people do? What can I do? What can the average voter do, and why? What would you say to someone who's, says, I don't think that my voice counts. I don't think that there's anything that I, as an individual, can do to change the system. And so I'm completely disenfranchised and I'm not going to even be part of the political system anymore because it's not for me. What would you say to that person?
The third part of my life, you mentioned I'm a farmer, I'm a veteran, but I'm also an educator, and I've spent 17 years in education. So my passion right now is to educate people and to remind them that ultimately, in a democracy such as ours, a constitutional republic based in democracy, you are the ultimate arbiter of the law and of the government. And so for that feeling of disempowerment, understand that you do have far more power than you could ever imagine. And that means that you have to vote, but that means you also have to reclaim your voice. And to do that, you have to talk to your legislators, talk to those political people that so-called represent you. Go to their town halls, send them letters. Paper letters work better than emails, but communicate with them, communicate your thoughts, and tell them very clearly that ultimately I'm your boss, and I will withhold the thing that you need the most, which is my vote, come election. Do that in the primary, because in most states, the primary is the most important election. If we, 330 million people, realize the real power that we have, then we can make that change through the ballot. And organizations like American Promise, organizations like the Bridge Alliance, organizations that are trying to restore democracy to what it was meant to be, those organizations, get involved. Sign on, get their newsletters, get the information, educate yourself on what's happening, and then find out how you can be that change that you want to see in the world. And that might mean attending town halls. That might mean starting a miniature American Promise organization in your community. It might mean just a letter writing campaign or a postcard writing campaign. And let them know that you're aware. Let them know that you're not just going to sit out the next election. Because that's what a lot of politicians want. They want you to sit out the election. Don't. Be in that next election and be that voice that you want. Reclaim the power that our founding fathers gave us and what every veteran throughout this country's history has fought and often died for. Take back the power.